Good afternoon, everybody. This is Steve Wilson at the Illinois State Water Survey at the University of Illinois, and I'm joined today by Katie Hollenbeck from the Water Resources Center and Dan Webb, who's also at the Water Survey and runs our Public Service Lab. And today, this webinar is entitled, Is My Water Safe to Drink? Common Questions About Private Wells. And really, it's about water quality and sampling and some of those issues today. Many of you asked questions when you registered, and we will get through some of those today. I guess we had 218 people register, and right now there are 63 of you. One thing I do want to mention is that if you are a sanitarian and you can take this now through NEHA, or NEHA will support this for us, I think 1.5 CEUs. You need to contact us afterward. You can send an email to info@privatewellclass.org, and Katie Hollenbeck can talk about that at the end when that question comes up. So, all right, so we're going to get started. And I do want to mention that the private well class in our program, which, the webinars are just one piece of the things that we do to support private well owners, is funded through US EPA to a grant to RCAP, the Rural Community Assistance Partnership, and we work with RCAP and their staff around the country to support well owners and their issues. So we're fortunate here at the U of I to be at a location like the State Water Survey, which is a sister agency to a state geological survey. We house the well records for the state of Illinois. Dan runs our Public Service Lab, which offers well testing to private well owners in Illinois. And so we are the research arm of the state, if you will, that provides support to well owners. They call us frequently asking questions in Illinois, and that's part of my job. So the fact that we're able to do this on a national scale is really awesome for us. So, okay. I've already said some of these things, I'm sure, but the webinar materials today follow at least a piece of the private well class program. It is being recorded. We record all of our webinars, and we're up to around 27 or 28 on various topics, and you can go on our website and find those. Everything is free. The class is free. The webinars are free. Any of the materials we develop are free, all because this is funded through US EPA. And though everyone who registered was able to ask questions, we won't get to everyone's, but we will also take questions at the end. We've basically picked out the questions that kind of meet a good summary of all the questions that have been asked in advance, and we'll answer those. And then we'll also, if you have questions, Katie's monitoring the question box or the chat box, if it's one or the other on your screen, in GoToWebinar. And you can ask questions if something comes up that I say that you aren't clear about, or you have another question that comes to you because of the material we present today. And we'll try to do that at the end. And Dan and I certainly more than willing to stay and talk about some of these issues and answer the questions we can. And if we can't answer your question, we will take your question. We ask you to email us. We'll find someone who can, and we'll get back to you. So I mentioned the three of us that are on here today, and so I'll move on. Dan is a chemist, runs our Public Service Lab, and so many of the things today are really more in his purview than mine. So, and I'm like, yeah, and here we go. First thing to remember is that private wells are not regulated. Now there are a few places in the eastern part of the country where a county or local health department may have regulations when a well is drilled or when it changes hands because of property transfer. But otherwise, if it's your house and you've had it a while and you plan to stay there a while, the water you're drinking is up to you. And so it's your responsibility to make sure it's safe and also to make sure your system's maintained. So, I grew up on an old dug well. It was only 14 feet deep. It was in the middle of a cattle pasture, probably not the best source of water in the world. But now I live in a community. I use city water, which is regulated by the US EPA through the Safe Drinking Water Act. And so the money that I pay, the $40 or $50 a month I mentioned here, is spread out over all of our residents so that our water system can test the water, make sure that water comes right to my tap, and also maintain the source in which we are using groundwater in Champaign-Urbana. And so, it's easy for me to not have that responsibility living in town, and they make sure it's safe. So they're the ones testing the water to make sure that it actually meets all the requirements of the Safe Drinking Water Act. Safe is a loose word. I think I mentioned that on one of the questions we get at the end. Quote, safe is a moving target. You can say it's safe because it meets all of the Safe Drinking Water Act requirements, but there are also things that might not be on the Safe Drinking Water Act requirements that could be harmful. And so, it's really up to you to be diligent and understand those things. So, and lastly, contaminants, it's usually not the same things you see or can smell or taste that are the problem. A lot of times those are harmless. It's the ones that you can't, a lot of times, that end up being, the water looks great, but it may have arsenic or, some other contaminant that, consumed over a long period of time could be really harmful. And so, as I mentioned a minute ago, it's really about you being diligent and being aware. So what our class does really is try to help you understand everything about your well. So you need to have your well log and know where your water's coming from. Is it a bedrock aquifer, or is it sand and gravel, or do you have a shallow dug or bored well that's just collecting water from near the surface? All those things matter, and well type matters, because they basically, the deeper typically you are, the more protected you are from surface water contaminants. But in some deeper aquifers, there may be naturally occurring contaminants. So you need to understand both sides of that. And the point of our class is really to help you learn to ask the right questions and know where to find local sources of information. And then lastly, drive the point home that you need to sample your well. It's estimated that almost 2/3 of all private wells in use today have never been tested by their owner for any kind of contaminant. And that's a problem. It's a public awareness issue. It's an understanding that, well water can, in most cases, is very safe to drink, but until you test it, you can never be sure. It's one of those out of sight, out of mind things that seems to creep up on folks. So the main thing today we're going to talk about is water quality and testing. And so these are some of the questions that we get regularly. How often do I sample? What do I sample for? All those sorts of things. And so we'll go through some basics that we recommend to people and why, and and get to what to do and how to answer all of these questions. So first of all, where do I collect the sample? You need to understand that the water coming out of your kitchen tap could be chemically different from the water at your well or an outside tap. So for instance, when Dan, a well owner, calls Dan at our lab, he asks them if they have any kind of treatment, or if they have if it's an older home, anything that might indicate that there's either potential for something in the premise plumbing that could cause a contaminant, or if there's something, if there's treatment, so that he can look at the difference between, quote, groundwater, like a spigot at the well, versus what's coming out of the kitchen tap. So that's what we do. We then send those folks 2 sample kits, so they can collect a sample that's before any kind of treatment, and then one that's at your kitchen sink that's after any kind of treatment. That way we have an idea of what the groundwater quality is, as well as the drinking water quality for the well owner. And many times there's some significant differences, and I'll show you an example of that here in a little bit. As far as contacting a lab, what I tell everyone that has a well, not only is it buyer beware if you're buying a house, it's really up to you as the buyer, whatever it costs you. If it's $600 or $300, whatever, your peace of mind and the value of your property depend on your well being acceptable for drinking water. So when you call a lab, they should be able to provide you really good instructions on what to sample, how to sample, what they expect, how quick to return the sample. If it's, some things have a holding time of less than 24 hours or less. And if you call a lab and they can't give you that information, or they're not really helpful, I would find a different lab. Many labs will mail you the kits if you need be. And so we just did a webinar last summer that was specifically for labs. We had 138 labs that were both public health labs and private labs. from around the country participate, and I told them the same thing. Hey, I tell well owners that if you can't answer their questions, they should find a different lab. So it's in their best interest to understand well issues, groundwater quality issues in their area, and all those things. So what to test for? It really does depend on a lot of factors. The depth of your well, if it's a shallower well, then you're at more risk for surface contaminants. Understanding if it's bedrock or sand and gravel, so what formation it might be coming from. You know, there's been a lot of work done in nearly every state looking at natural groundwater quality. So for instance, in Illinois, I can tell you where there's natural occurring arsenic in what aquifers. And in some areas, which we'll get into some examples in a minute, they know if there's some natural occurring issue. Or for instance, in Virginia, the Piedmont aquifer is typically, it's granite, so it's not buffered very well, and so the pH is typically pretty low, and so that adds to the risk of any kind of lead or copper or lead solder issues if your water's already corrosive to start with. So you should ask your county or your state health department or local health district for advice. They'll know if there's something naturally occurring specifically, or if you're near some sort of, if you're right next door to a gas station, they'd probably recommend that you sample for those kind of chemicals just to be sure. And so there's other folks too. Ask your neighbors or a driller if you trust your driller. You've worked with your driller or contractor in the past, and they'll know as well if there's something going on, as well as co-op extension. But yeah, always ask your health department for advice. Their interest is in protecting your health as much as you are. You have that interest, if you will. And so what we recommend is to sample for coliform and nitrate annually. Now, coliform and nitrate aren't necessarily a contaminant per se, aren't really a health risk, but they're an indicator. And they're so prevalent in the surface and near surface environment that what we use those for is to determine if there might be a pathway into your well. So if you find nitrate, then likely there's a source nearby that can get into your well at a shallow depth, whether that's livestock, your septic system, or some other issue for bacteria. And so, in those cases, you just want to sample. If you have coliform bacteria, you'd want to sample for E. coli then as a follow-up. And also, you want to try to find what's causing that to get in your well. Maybe you have an old duck well like I grew up on. I guarantee you our well always had coliform bacteria in it. So it's just understanding what that's for, because coliform itself isn't necessarily harmful. It's E. coli and other things that indicate it can get in your well from the surface that are the problem. So as an example, so this is from the Rhode Island Department of Health. They have these little dots are where there used to be orchards that for many years were using arsenic as a pesticide. And so they've mapped all those and provide that information to say, if you live next to an old orchard, or there's an orchard that existed a long time ago there, there's certainly a risk for arsenic contamination. And in some of those cases, the amount of arsenic in the soil almost makes it impossible to build a house. It's just it's high. And the big splotch in the middle is one of my, really interesting. I didn't realize until we started this program 4 years ago that beryllium was actually a regulated contaminant. So every community water supply has to make sure that the beryllium in their water, which is very rare to even find, is below a certain level. And Rhode Island happens to have a lot of it. So where this big splotch is in the center of the state, if you have a well there, they recommend you test for beryllium to make sure it's not over the health limit set by the EPA, which is a good point to make here. The Safe Drinking Water Act requires every community to meet a certain set of water quality standards. Those are called the primary drinking water contaminants. As a well owner, again, they use those as a guide, and we do too. It's a good guide to say, if you test for these things and they're below these limits, then according to the EPA for community water supply, it's considered safe to drink. And so we would also suggest that then that means it's probably safe to drink if it's below all those limits that have been set. So that's where that comes from. Other examples, Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection has this nice website where you can type in your address, and they'll tell you if you're at risk for uranium or arsenic contamination in your well, especially this is for bedrock wells, which is most of the state. And so if you live in Massachusetts, you can go to the site, type that in, and they'll recommend whether you need to be concerned about those things. And so that comes from data that's been collected from sampling private wells, community wells, from their state geological survey, the USGS, and probably even DEP maybe has a groundwater sampling program. And so they've been able to map where there might be some of these issues. And that's becoming more prevalent, which is why I'm showing these examples. More states are starting to do these things. And so if you just go look, you may find information that might help you understand what you need to sample for or be concerned about in your area. This is from the state of Wisconsin. Obviously, their Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources is a primacy agency in Wisconsin, and they've taken a lot of water quality data in their state, and they've had the University of Stevens Point map it. And so you can go on this website in Wisconsin, and I clicked on display arsenic by county. And so it shows me, in one county it says they've had none detected, and everywhere else there's at least a little bit of arsenic. The MCL, or the maximum contaminant level allowed for a community water supply, is 10 ppb, or micrograms per liter. And you can see here the counties where it's above those values, at least the average samples they've collected. And on their website you can find more data about number of samples. In some cases there may be very few here, but at least it gives you an idea that if you're in one of these red areas, you might want to at least sample for arsenic to be sure that your well is not over the health standard. And this is the Department of Ecology in Washington State. They went as far as to map individual well water quality, which is really cool. There's 2,300 wells here at 2231 locations that are listed here. Many of these are private wells where they've collected a sample and they know what the water quality is for each of those. And so you can go on this website, and it's a mapping tool, and you can zoom in and you can look at water quality not only of your well but the folks around you or nearby, or if you're looking at a property. And so there's this stuff's becoming much more common, and it's brought up a lot of issues about property values and privacy issues. And I think what we're starting to see is that protecting the source water, the aquifer, and understanding what the water quality is taking precedent over an individual's right to protect, quote, the secrecy of their water quality. So it's better if everybody knows, and everybody knows what's going on. In many cases, these things can be treated, and so it's a matter of adding treatment to your system. It doesn't mean that the water you can't use it. So these are just some examples. I know there's other states that are developing these currently, and they'll be, in 5 years, I expect many states to have at least some of this information up on their websites. So what we suggest is, as I mentioned earlier, sampling for coliform and nitrate annually. And again, that's really an indicator to tell you that there's a pathway into your well. And that's just a way to make sure your well integrity is still there and your well is safe, so that, over time, welds can go bad, or if it's steel, or if it's, things can happen. The best example I have, I grew up on a small farm, and I know I was kind of a madman on our riding lawnmower. It's really easy for someone to hit a PVC well that's sticking up in the middle of the yard, especially a teenager, and crack that well. And once that crack is there, now there's exposure to bugs and anything in the soil. We had an example working with RCAP staff in Virginia where there was this PVC well in the middle of a yard. They couldn't figure out why they kept having bacteria hits. And they sent me a picture, and there's probably an 8-inch or 20-inch diameter tree about a foot or 2 feet from the well. So what's happened in that case is, as the tree has grown, the roots got around the annulus, or around the outside of the well casing, and eventually it's expanded and cracked that casing. And so, there's a lot of bugs along tree roots, and so they'll, as long as that stuff's there, they're going to have coliform hits every time they sample. So then after that, we suggest that initially, if you've never sampled, just to get an idea of the general water quality of the water that you're pulling from your well, so your groundwater quality, is to do this list in the middle. It includes fluoride and goes through alkalinity there. It's really an indicator of your general water quality that a chemist or someone from your state, a geochemist from your state geological survey, or if you have a water survey like we are, can give you an idea of, how hard your water is, if you have any kind of concerns. Things like natural chlorine fluoride do happen around the country. And they also, the message here is they shouldn't change too much. So if your pH is 7.4, 5 years from now, your pH should be really close to 7.4, if not right on. Same with arsenic. What we found is that a well that has arsenic, say at 40 or 50 ppb, if we go back 5 or 10 years later and sample it, the groundwater is basically the same. If it's fairly protected from the surface, especially a deeper aquifer, the water quality is fairly consistent. And so doing this every 3 to 5 years gives you a gauge to go by. So if all of a sudden your turbidity is off the floor there, or the pH has changed, or the alkalinity is much different, that might indicate that something's happened to the well in between. And so you may want to investigate then and try to understand what's going on. But in general, water quality in groundwater is good. Sometimes there's a naturally occurring contaminant like arsenic, and again, those can be treated for, but in many cases, well water is perfectly safe, and doing this test every, say, 5 years just gives you peace of mind that it's still the same as it has been. And we see wells that are upwards of 100 years old that are still in use and still fine. In some cases, if they've been properly constructed and all that stuff. So, and lastly, these don't cover everything. Like, you don't see uranium here or any kind of man-made contaminants. And so get advice from your local or state health department or county health department and ask if there's anything in your area that might be a concern. There are things that happen. Currently in the news is PFOA and PFOS, perfluorinated compounds. They're seeing those in the Northeast, like I believe in New Hampshire and Vermont in some areas. And, those are because of man-made issues. And, that's not something you would normally test for. But if that kind of issue is going on in your area, your local health department's going to know about it. And that's why you need to ask them. So, okay. So I want to show you one example. And this is from our lab, from Dan's lab. And this is a sample from 2015. And I guess the interesting things here, it might be kind of hard to read, and I apologize if it is, but this is natural Illinois groundwater. So it's fairly hard. The sodium here is at 25.9. It's got a fair amount of turbidity and color, 29.8 for turbidity and 48.1 for color. And I'll be honest, I'm not a chemist. I don't understand those units. Dan can explain them to you. And for hardness, it's 351 milligrams per liter. So the less than arrows mean it's below detection limit. And so a number of things, weren't detected, like nitrate, for instance, which is a good thing. And this well is about 240 feet deep, and so you wouldn't expect there to be nitrate or coliform issues here. But what's interesting is this sample is from an outside spigot, which it's before any kind of treatment. But this person has a number of treatment pieces in place, and so he sampled all of them. And so this is the raw water sample, which for me as a groundwater hydrologist and someone who's looking at natural groundwater quality for the work I do at the survey, this is what I'm most interested in, is what is the natural water quality to start with, so that we can give better advice to other well owners about what treatment they might need and things like that. And so then he has a filter, a softener, and it also has an RO, or reverse osmosis unit. And you can see what happened here. This is after the filter and the softener. So on the right side, the turbidity and the color have went way down. I forgot to mention the pH, I think, on that last sample was 8.02, and so it's went up to 8.10, which is really a minor change, even probably within some sort of error bar. So nothing's really changed. But the hardness went from 350-something to 0.68. So the softener is doing its job, right? It's taking out all the hardness, providing soft water, that sort of thing. But the other interesting thing, some of the things you might not consider, is using sodium chloride, and And so now the sodium went from 25 up to 198. And for most people, that's not an issue. But if you happen to be on a low sodium diet and not understand that your softener is increasing the amount of sodium that you're intaking, that could be an issue and something to watch out for. And so I think this is really eye-opening for many well owners to see how your water softener actually and your filter, what they actually do. They're removing things in some cases, but they're also adding, because you're replacing some of those hardness ions with manganese and iron, I believe, Dan. And
sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah, iron and manganese and some of the other cations. It's a cation exchange resin, so there are some other things. Barium and strontium, it seems like, are a couple of things that we often see at fairly reasonable levels in water, and softeners can take those out too. When you get down to things that are trace amounts of things, it's kind of risky. You usually think of the softeners taking out calcium and magnesium, but it does work on some of these other things too.
Right. Well, and we've even seen in Illinois through the samples that go through Dan's lab that in some cases where the chemistry is just right, the softener is actually co-precipitating arsenic with iron. And so you're seeing arsenic drop. Even though a softener isn't made for reducing arsenic, in some cases it actually does. So the interesting thing here, though, is how it's dropped the hardness, how it's increased the sodium. pH has stayed fairly consistent. And so lastly, the next slide is after the reverse osmosis unit, which it basically takes out all minerals, and so or in much of them. So you can see there's a ton more of these constituents in the water that are now less than, which means they weren't detected. But the one thing to point out is another unintended consequence. When you take all that stuff out, which kind of helps buffer the water, now the pH has dropped from 8.1 down to 6.23. And, in a situation like I mentioned, the Piedmont aquifer in Virginia, where it's granite and the pH may already start at 6.23 or lower, you may have even more of a drop. And, as the water gets more, a lower pH usually means higher corrosivity. And so it's something to be concerned about if you have copper pipes with lead solder and some of those things. And I just include this because to me it's really interesting how changing, you're taking things out, but you're also changing other things in the chemistry. So if this RO unit is right at the kitchen tap, it's probably not a big deal. But if for some reason you had a whole house reverse osmosis unit, which would be really expensive, and it's not common, and then that water after the RO is sitting in your pipes, it'd be more likely to corrode lead solder and copper pipes and some of those things. So it's just interesting. So going on, when should I test my well? Well, in addition to what we've already mentioned, anytime the well's been opened, it's recommended that you sample your well. So if your pump goes bad and you have to have your pump pulled, it's probably a good idea to disinfect your well. And then test it to make sure that, nothing's been introduced. Things can happen. Stuff can fall down a well. Maybe you'll end up finding out that the seal, the gasket wasn't put on properly, and now there's ants around your well or something like that. I mean, there's a lot of things that can happen. And then anytime there's an emergency event, and we're showing an example here of a melted well cap after a forest fire, and this is from Colorado. It's provided by a county there to us. And so there's a lot of things, or a flood. One of the examples I use a lot is that you buy this 5-acre property that sits above this beautiful stream up on a bluff. You build the house and realize that there's no water up on the bluff and you can't get a well that has water. So you go down to the bottom ground next to the stream and put in a well that's in the alluvial sand, which is shallow, and, not understanding that maybe every spring that floods and overtops your well. So now you've got an issue of every spring you could be contaminating your well because of surface water contamination. So understanding all that and what risks you might have is, again, part of, this webinar is just a small piece of what our class teaches you, and we can get into that later. So where do you get it analyzed? Every state accredits labs and try to use one on the list. Some states actually have programs for private well testing. I know Iowa has their state legislature provides funds to counties that are interested in doing the work to either help subsidize sampling or in some cases help abandon wells. And so you can look there. The state of New Mexico has a program through their through their septic and wastewater program that if you'll add your septic system onto their list so they have a record of where it's at and all those details, they'll give you a free water sample. And so you can look around and see if there's anything to contact your county. I know Tazewell County in Illinois has a number of times during Groundwater Awareness Week, which is in March. I don't remember the date right now, but you can Google that online and find it. They offer free water sampling for that week. And, it's just a way to raise awareness and help folks who might want to sample get that done. And as far as what lab to use, I mentioned, one of the questions was about labs and how to find labs. And so when we get to the end, when I'm answering some of the questions we received, I'll provide more details on that as far as how to find a lab. But they should be able to tell you everything about sampling. If you need to preserve it, which isn't typical these days, how to store it, to refrigerate it, how soon it needs to be returned, and, make sure that you're comfortable. Don't just accept things if you don't understand them. Take the time and work with a lab to make sure that you're clear on what they expect so that, you're collecting the sample properly and all those things if you're doing it yourself. Some labs come out and do sampling. I know for things like in Pennsylvania, if it's related to fracking, to be, quote, legally defensible sample, the lab actually has to come out, or someone who's an agent for the lab has to come out and collect the sample. You can't do it yourself. And so it's, it depends on your situation and what you're after. And but yeah, again, a lab should also provide all the equipment and the bottles and everything you need. As far as interpreting results, I'm going to show you a really great website that the state of New Hampshire developed. This website, along with other documents that are online, you can use those once you get your sampling results to get an idea of what they mean. Like what our lab does, what Dan does, is sends a letter along with the sample results that says, hey, your arsenic's at 15 and that's above what's considered safe by the US EPA and the Safe Drinking Water Act, which is 10, ppb, that sort of thing. And then they can call back and get advice from Dan if they're interested. And so one thing we recommend is if you do find something in your well, resample to confirm, especially if it's really high or really oddball. There's nowhere else in the area where you found that, or the county's never found that. And again, if bacteria is found through a coliform bacteria test, then the next thing to do is to test for E. coli. E. coli are harmful, and they indicate a pathway of some kind of either livestock or human waste being able to get into your well. And, that's dangerous because that means there's other things, viruses and other types of bacteria that are harmful that also have a way in and, may be a problem. So as far as interpreting results, the bottom line is after you've looked this stuff online, don't be too alarmed right away no matter what's there until you talk to a health professional. So that means, go to your local health department or your county health department and ask the environmental health professional there to go over your results with you and explain them to you. Make an appointment if you need to, do whatever. But talk to someone who is qualified to really tell you what these mean. It could be as simple as like the tool I'm going to show you in a minute. If you put in the wrong units, it changes it by 1,000 times. So if it says 5 ppb of arsenic on your result and you accidentally put in 5 ppm, it's going to say that you have a heck of a lot of arsenic in your well, and it's just a matter of entering a number wrong or entering the units wrong. And so be safe and be sure before you're too concerned, because as I said, most groundwater and private wells are typically the water quality is pretty good. And so it's just a matter of being safe and being sure, and especially for an older well, there's more risk that there's some kind of breach in that, or that the grout around the annulus isn't still in place, or some of those things that could make your well more vulnerable. So this is the thing I mentioned. The New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services developed this Be Well Informed guide, And so, and this was developed for the residents in New Hampshire, but it actually is a great tool for any of us. There's some New Hampshire specific information on this website, and I would recommend that you talk to your local, your state health department in your state, or an analogous department, whether that be a DEQ or DES or whatever it might be, or DNR in Wisconsin, so that you're talking to the folks that their job is to help you understand what it means to be a well owner in your state and what issues you might have. But there's a place here at the bottom where it says enter your water test results. And so if we do that, I typed in 15 micrograms per liter where the units there is in green. It's a drop-down menu, and you can see there milligrams per liter, micrograms per liter, ppm, ppb. And all I can say is, our class that's online that you can go take, it's one lesson a week for 10 weeks, which is also free. One of the pretest questions we ask is to do a math conversion from two different units that are listed here. And so it's reported one way, but you have to enter it another way. And only 27% of about 4,000 people who've taken our pretest have actually got that right. And so, just like many of you, if you're not using, I don't use some math every day. It's easy to just forget some of those things and what the basic rules are for doing some of those conversions. And so, and that's why I said earlier about take it to someone who's qualified to look at the results. And there's a place up here on the upper right where you can say what New Hampshire town or city you live in. There's a drop-down list. Many of the towns in New Hampshire do not have a public water system. There are private wells. And so that's relevant certainly for the state to have more data and to understand how to help the residents in New Hampshire. But you can also type in anonymous if you choose to, which, kudos to the DES there. They're more interested in having people use the site and get good information than they are about collecting their data, which, some people still are providing that, which is really important. So anyway, so we put in a value that's over the health limit for community water supply, 15 micrograms per liter, where the standard's 10. And so this is what it told me. The value entered it's got an X. It exceeds the drinking water limit. And again, they're using the limits that are set by the EPA for community water supplies. This doesn't mean that you have to meet that limit. If you want to drink water with 15 micrograms of arsenic, you're more than willing. You can. And there's a lot of people who have always lived in the same location. I grew up on a farm. I mentioned that. My grandpa would have said, I've drank this water my whole life. It hasn't hurt me. He probably could care less if our water had arsenic over the limit. But, that's to each their own if you want to do that. But this is what's been established as safe. And the other added value of this website is they also tell you what kind of treatment you might be able to use that removes arsenic. And, this is really a tricky thing. A lot of folks, after they get a water sample and a result back, it's now what? And you might be relying on a salesman to tell you what kind of system you need. And unfortunately, in some cases, those folks may try to oversell certain things. And this tells you some of those types of devices that would actually work for your concern. Now, I only typed in one value. If I'd have typed in a full suite of analysis on the first page here, I might get a different answer because, you may have to run a filter before you run the point of use like an RO system if you don't want to clog it and have it be ineffective. And I'm not sure I say this later, so I'm going to say it now so I don't forget. But if you're going to add treatment to your well, to your drinking water, the most important thing you can do is to make sure that you maintain it. Because an RO system that isn't changed out when it needs to be can be a great place for bacteria to start growing, and eventually you're creating your own internal bacteria problem or things like that. So, treatment is really important in some cases, like if you have a contaminant like arsenic, but you also have to realize that it's a commitment to maintain it, or you could be causing yourself other problems. This is just more of that page, and you can see down at the bottom it says chloride, copper, all those things I did not enter, but it gives you kind of an understanding of your treatment options. And NSF ANSI standard 53 is a carbon filter system, and the EPA's tested those a lot after what happened at Flint, Michigan, and it turns out those things work really well for removing lead, as another example. So, and if you don't understand those standards, you can go on NSF's website and read about all that, or you can talk to someone either at a lab or who sells treatment equipment, or even a community water operator may have some information that would be helpful. And I know in some states, community water supply operators are getting a lot of calls from private well owners nearby about issues, especially if they have a boil order or they know there's some contaminant that comes out during that's in their natural groundwater, on how to treat that. So they're another source that you can lean on, and that's someone who obviously is in the community and cares about the area. So as far as interpreting results, as I mentioned before, these are only a guide, like the Be Well Informed tool. It's a guide to give you an idea of what might be going on, but go to a health department and get a qualified answer from an environmental health professional. Their job is to make sure that your health is protected, and they want to make sure that you're being safe as well. So, and I'd say here at the bottom, they cannot tell you to stop drinking your water or condemn your well. They can only recommend it, and that's true probably about 95% of the country. There are some places out east where either a local health district or a county health department may have passed their own rules where they are concerned about health and may, especially if it's a sample for property transfer, they may be able to say, well, you can't sell this home until this has been dealt with. And so just keep that in mind. But yeah. Okay, a little bit about well construction. Every state but Alaska and Pennsylvania have well construction code. So there's a specific code that says you can only use certain kinds of pipe. It has to be put in this way. It has to, have to have a stand pipe that's above ground so many inches. A lot of those details that are meant to protect the well owner who may not understand a lot of those issues very well, except those two states. But in every state that's passed a law that says here's proper well construction and has a department that enforces that, any old wells were grandfathered in. So when I say we find wells that are 100 years old, we find wells that are much, I know one of the RCAP folks found a well in, I think, Massachusetts that was put in the 1860s and still being used today. So they can last a long time. That doesn't mean you should be using that. Like the well I grew up on, no one should be drinking water out of that well. It's vulnerable to surface contamination. When it rains, the water gets cloudy. It's in a ravine where water runs off from the surface toward the well through a cattle pasture, things like that. So you need to understand, one, if your well was properly constructed, either based on today's code or when the well was installed, and what those differences might be, or if it was grandfathered in and you're still using a well that may not be grouted or may only have 6 foot of casing if it's in a shallow bedrock, or some of those things that put it more at risk. In addition, wells and pits still exist today. And if you've not ever heard of this, there's a device called a pitless adapter, which allows you to, it's about 4 feet down in the well, and it's basically an elbow to run water into your house through the side of the well casing. And the pitless adapter sits in place, can be pulled with the pump so that you can still get to the pump if it's a submersible pump. And it was developed as a way not to put a well in a pit anymore. So in the old days, which you can define that in a lot of ways, but many very old wells were put in pits, especially in the northern half of the country where there's a frost line and freezes during the winter, so that your pipes didn't freeze. So like here where I'm at in Illinois, in a really cold winter, we could have frozen soil down to maybe 3 feet. And so there are pits that were 4 feet deep or more, so that all the pipe could be ran into the house below that frost line, and the well was just down in this pit. The problem with that is they provide, it's a pit, it's like a great storage place for water during a big rainstorm. So now if your well isn't perfectly sealed and the gasket isn't in place like it's supposed to be, you're going to have surface contamination getting in your well. And they're also a safety hazard. We run into a lot of cases where an old well just had a piece of plywood over it. Someone either drove over it or stepped through it or those sorts of things. And, people get hurt, damaged equipment, all that sort of stuff. So what we recommend, and here's some examples. The picture on the left is from the Washington State Department of Ecology. They have a blog on there for their well program, and so they show a lot of good examples where this has happened in Washington State, where there was a piece of plywood over the entire well, and the woman who lived there probably stepped on that plywood hundreds or thousands of times in her lifetime. This time she stepped and it broke through and it killed her. And so, having a proper seal on the top and having your well properly constructed certainly matter. And, the picture on the right is self-explanatory. That's a goat that fell down into a well. No one realized it early on. And, these things really happen. And that's all I can tell you. If your well's not sealed properly, the well I grew up on, we had frogs get in our well one time. And, these things are certainly a health risk. So what do you do with these wells? You should have a contractor extend the pipe up above the surface, fill it in with clay grout so you're protecting around the well casing. And if you need to install a pitless, do so. But, talk to someone beforehand and find out what they would recommend. If you're in a state like I live in Illinois, where our county health departments go out and inspect every new well, they're a good source of advice. Also a contractor or any other well authority that may be nearby on proper construction, or the state agency that regulates well construction in your state, about what they would recommend doing. And if you're going to have a contractor come out and do that to your well and bring it up to surface and make sure it's got a proper cap and all those things, it doesn't hurt to ask more than one and get some advice and make sure that, you're getting all the information you can. The other piece of this is abandoned wells. So until, it depends on the state, there weren't any rules for well construction. So even in Illinois, where we passed a law in 1968 that says you have to file a permit and a log with the county health department, when we go out and do work looking in a specific area at all the wells, we end up finding almost as many wells that we don't have on file in our well records as we do wells that are. And that's from 1968. In Nebraska, it was 1986. In New York, it wasn't until 2000. So, I've done a little work in New York over the last 2 summers, and my guess is that the New York State only has about 10% of the well logs of all the wells that are in use in New York. And that's wells that are actually being used. Many of these places, especially if a new house gets built, they put in a new well. But there's an old well that was by the barn back when, the old farmstead was there. And it's still there. It's undocumented. Katie and I actually participated in a well sealing demonstration with county health department that did this demonstration as a learning experience and an opportunity for CEUs, for sanitarians in Western Illinois. And it turned out these people bought this house. Right by their back door, next to the foundation of their house, was this old hand-dug well, 22 foot deep, uncemented brick, and it was in Macomb, Illinois, which is a town of about 16,000 people, I believe. And this well was actually 4 blocks from downtown, in the middle of town. They've had public water since 1916, so that well predates that, and it was just sitting there with a concrete pad over it. And a lot of cigarette butts and lighters inside it, where the 2-inch hole for the hand pump was. It turned out that because this is an open hole that didn't have any water in it, their foundation was starting to cave into the well. So it was sealed properly, filled in, and by doing so, they've protected their foundation, for one, but also in a lot of cases, they don't have a good concrete seal on top, and so they're a risk. Old boards, I'll show you an example in a second. So the bottom line is if you have an abandoned well on your property, you need to abandon it. An old well is not being used. It leaves you responsible. People can get hurt. It also can contaminate an aquifer, and it might be your own water supply that you're damaging. So if you know you have an old well and it's not being used, you can't count on someone not wandering onto your property in a lot of cases, and then you would be liable. So as an example, here's a horse in a well, and also these are both from the Washington State Department of Ecology from their blog. They do a great job of getting information out there about some of these things. And a man fell 45 feet into the well, and there they've got a tripod. They're trying to lift him out. He was very fortunate. He was fine in the end. On the right here are 4 newspaper clippings, the third one being Jessica McClure. Those of you that are old enough remember when her rescue was covered live on CNN. I think it took, like a day or 18 hours or something like that. And she got stuck in a small well. And so these things happen, These other 3 articles are all from the same year, 1997, from Illinois. 3 different parts of the state, all fairly local papers. And so, it happens a lot more often. It just doesn't get national exposure. And in 2 of these cases, someone died. So, it does happen. There's a lot of these wells out there. We have about 500,000 well logs in our records, and we estimate there's probably between 800 and a million wells actually in use in Illinois, and there's probably close to another million somewhere, and that's my guess, that are abandoned and not in use, and most of those no one even knows where they are. And so they're a risk. If you know you have one, you should take care of it. So we're going to jump to the questions. That's all I have. As far as a quote lesson, that took a little longer than I planned, but the rest of this presentation is really answering questions that you folks have asked. And so I'm going to ask Dan to get back on the line here. And
okay, hi Steve.
And if you want to, the questions that are really related to, especially about test kits, I can read this, but they've gotten a lot more reliable. I know that, and I don't think we can specify any brands. But if there's something here you'd like to add about your experience with test kits, that'd be great.
I've had pretty good luck with most test kits. Some people will ask about lead or bacteria, some things. I haven't really had any experience with bacteria test kits and maybe some of the trace elements. I worry a little bit that they're not going to be sensitive enough. They might give you a false impression that there's no lead present, but it could be that they're very low and they're sensitive, but my experience has been more with the milligram per liter type things for things like nitrate, hardness, pH, and we've usually had pretty good luck. The biggest difficulties we have seen is interpretation of the colors. Like if the shades of the colors are off, they'll have a printed color chart that might be red, whereas the solution might actually look a little bit orange, so it's kind of hard to say. So there's some subjectivity to them, but they're not really a substitute for getting a real test, though. But if you're looking
they can be
for
a good indicator.
Yeah, they can be a good indicator.
Well, and for folks like me who are colorblind, those test kits where you're taking a strip and you're comparing the color, I know they have arsenic test strips like that go from basically white to dark brown, and there's some yellow in the middle and things like that. I'm having some trouble with some of those if they're subtle differences.
Yeah, that's all I meant, is that sometimes the differences are subtle, and I am a little bit colorblind too, so I'm probably not the best person to be looking at these. But
all right, thank you. So what are the tests to be done to assure drinking water is safe? Well, I should have put safe in quotes, and I did, I guess, in the answer there. But really the standard are the primary drinking water contaminants that every community water supply has to test for, and these are required under the Safe Drinking Water Act for any community water supply, any public water supply, which is either a community supply or a non-community supply that supplies water to 25 people at least 60 days a year. There's a lot of caveats there, but anything, so like a school or, or any community water supply where they're piping water to people's homes have to follow that list. And, it's a big list, and there are things that are surface water contaminants on it. It's pretty challenging to ask a well owner to sample for all those things. It could probably be into the thousands of dollars. And so the best thing to do is to sample the things that are most common in groundwater and, what might be recommended by your local health department. Now, I know, again, talking about back east, I was just in Massachusetts last week, and some of the local health districts there actually do require, at a home sale, sampling for all the primary drinking water contaminants, or at least a much bigger list than what we would recommend, just because there's more small communities that don't have public water supplies, but everyone's on a private well. And so then you have more urban issues where there's more chance for man-made contaminants to be an issue. And so the bottom line is work with a health professional, use the list that we have to start with. Certainly sampling for the things we recommended earlier don't mean your well is necessarily safe. And again, that's a word that, even groundwater professionals talk about a state wanting them to certify that a well is safe. Many won't do that just because there's things that can happen. There could be a plume of contamination that's nearby and not to the well yet. There's just a lot of issues safe's just a tough word, I guess. Anything to add? Dan?
No, that's a good answer, Steve. I was just thinking about that as you were talking about it. Safe, or what's considered a contaminant versus a naturally occurring thing that doesn't matter so much. It's kind of a tough definition because if you had an infinite amount of money, you could test for everything you could think of, but that's
right. And
never the case.
If someone is really concerned, there's two choices. One is to sample for everything that you possibly can, and the other is to just add treatment regardless of what your water quality is. I don't necessarily recommend either, but I certainly have ran into well owners who do one or the other of those things.
I'm sorry, Steve.
Oh, no, go ahead.
When we've had customers that are really worried about everything and they want to take a precaution even though they don't have evidence of it, they'll say, I'd rather remove everything. They will do what Steve suggested, put some treatment on it. Usually it involves like a reverse osmosis system. I've had one person double reverse osmosis their water. That does waste a lot of water, but there are things you can do like that can generically remove most of the solids and things. It doesn't get everything, but that's a different discussion.
Yeah. All right. And we're not trying to be wishy-washy about this. It's just, there's a reason why, for instance, HUD requires well owners to do their process, and their HUD manual, if you're buying a home through a HUD loan, is you have to you have to sample for whatever the local jurisdiction requires. And if there are no rules from the local jurisdiction, then you have to do what the state requires. And if there is no state rules, which is many states, then you have to sample for all the primary drinking water contaminants that the EPA requires. And what I can tell you is, there's really no one but maybe the buyer and the person who holds the loan interested in making sure the water is safe. Everybody else is trying to get the home sold. And so it becomes an issue where it's unequal protection, if you will. So I know we had a well owner contact us who bought a home in a county where they said all you have to test for is coliform nitrate. So they did that. So then the county deemed that as enough to be safe for sale. So they sold the home. About 16 months later, the homeowner tested their well and found out they have 150 ppb of arsenic, which is, 15 times the standard. And when she began to check around, found out that this is an aquifer that's known to have arsenic contamination. And so how that all happened, and this is, her side of the story, so to speak, but it certainly lends to when there aren't consistent rules, like for, in this case, a HUD loan, or that everybody's not on board and understanding what the risks might be, you can have problems. And I say that because every state has different priorities and rules for wells. So, for instance, in Illinois, our county health departments have to go out and inspect every brand new well that's drilled, every new well that's drilled, and they work with well owners when they have a problem. A number of our counties actually have their own lab to do some basic testing, whereas in some other states, there are no rules for private wells per se, other than construction rules. So the county or the health departments in those local jurisdictions really have nothing to do with well owners except when they get calls about a concern. And so they're much less prepared, educated, and ready to help a well owner understand those issues or to tell them what to sample for. And, I had a case where we were doing a well owner workshop in another state, and we had about 30 well owners there, and this is in person, and someone from the state health department came and helped answer questions with me, and one of the well owners said, "Where's our county health department? How come they aren't here?" And the RCAP person who set up the workshop said, I told them about this, I invited them, I asked them if they would come, and they declined. And so, and that's, I don't know what to do about that. But, and that's an isolated example. For the most part, the environmental health departments at public health departments are very engaged in what's going on with private well issues. So, and that's why we recommend that's where you go to ask. But, I got off track there. Okay, is testing for total coliform E. coli and nitrate enough to test if a well is safe to drink? I left this in because, excuse me, a lot of times that's what you hear, test for coliform and nitrate, and that's what, at least that's something. I mentioned earlier, 2/3 of well owners have never tested their well for anything. And so, in some cases, you're winning a small battle if you're a health professional, if you can get your well owners to even sample for those things. It's certainly not enough to know if your well is safe, but they are a good indicator that your well may not have any kind of opening or, crack casing or some other pathway that can get into a well. So there's other issues. We mentioned here it could be natural occurring, arsenic or beryllium, some of the things we mentioned earlier, or you could have an older house that has lead there's lead plumbing or copper plumbing, and it's corrosive water. So you really need to do a little more than that if you really want to understand the water you're drinking and if there's any kind of concern. And I guess that's it goes back to understanding the plumbing in your home. And I see that we've got a question for someone asking about the difference between house piping before and after 1986. It was about then that the law was changed and didn't allow lead pipes anymore in some of the states. And so many states passed that earlier, and I'm not a lead expert, but that's the year that we always hear as being, you really need to find out what your house plumbing was made of if it was installed prior to that. Because, there was a point where almost all piping was lead, and so in some really old homes, that can really be an issue. So hopefully I've answered that question a number of times as we went through this today. So going back to the qualified labs question, and you can Google this. I put the URL up here, but and this is DW Lab Cert for drinking water lab certification. So the US EPA on their website has a page where if you just Google certified US EPA certified drinking water labs, it'll take you to this page. It'll be one of the top hits. And so I included it here. If you can write it down, great. I'll leave it up for a second. But, you can find this stuff. And, that's part of all of this for anyone who owns a well is if you become a decent investigator about things, you can find a lot of good information from reputable sources like your state health department or local health department or US EPA or CDC that will give you a lot of information about your well, concerns about water quality in certain aquifers. In that respect, even the USGS has mapped a lot of water quality around the country, and there's stuff available online that can tell you some of those things. And I apologize, I've been fighting a cold, so I just put a cough drop in my mouth. Otherwise, I'm going to start coughing. So moving on, if you click on this link, it takes you to this page, certification of laboratories that analyze drinking water samples to ensure compliance with regulations. Now, the certification that EPA does is only to accredit labs so they can do drinking water samples for community water supplies so that those water supplies can meet the requirements of the Safe Drinking Water Act. So in some large communities, they have their own lab that's EPA certified. And so, you may see, just as an example, you may see on this list, if you're in New York, you may see New York City or Buffalo, the city of Buffalo labs. Maybe, and I don't know that for sure. I'm just using that as an example. But some of the larger communities have, it's worth it. They have to do enough samples, and they need to assure things. So they've went through all the steps and have shown that they do sufficient quality work and use the right methods so that they're doing their own analysis. And in those cases, most of those labs probably wouldn't do private well samples. And so this list will have labs that'll say, I'm sorry, we don't do private well sampling. But I've also ran into communities where they may do private well samples for their neighboring area outside of the city limits just as a courtesy. And so, it's certainly worth finding out if you're in that situation. As you scroll down this page, you come to a place where it says, click on this link to find information about certification programs and certified labs. So I clicked on that. It took me to this page. And then if you scroll down this page, there's a nice handy map and a drop-down menu of states. So you can click on your state, you can click on the drop-down menu, and then click on your state, and it'll take you to, it depends on the state, it may be a PDF or it may be another website. I'm in Illinois, so I clicked on Illinois knowing that the Illinois EPA is our primacy agency that regulates drinking water for community water supplies in Illinois. And so when I clicked on Illinois, I get this page from the Illinois Environmental Protection Agency. And it's a PDF you can download of accredited labs and what they test for. And in this particular case, I didn't go to the page, but they break it out by chemical analysis versus microbial analysis. So for instance, our university lab here that Dan manages is no longer EPA certified. It used to be, but the rules have gotten so strict that it was we weren't able to afford to continue to be accredited. So we won't show up on this list per se, but we do use all the EPA methods and all those things. But what's listed here is not only the way the Illinois EPA does it. That first PDF isn't just drinking water. It includes wastewater, soils, everything, and they've broken it up into different categories. So it's about a 70-page PDF. And the one thing I will also mention, if I didn't already, is that in many cases there are labs that are around the country who can handle a large volume and may do samples for communities that are out of their state. So this list will include labs that are not in Illinois because they are certified by Illinois EPA to do samples for Illinois communities, but it doesn't mean the lab is physically in Illinois. And so you need to be aware of that. So, but again, call them. You can find out. So, so moving on. Dan, I'm going to let you answer this for a second. And I'm going to mute myself.
Okay. How do I eliminate sulfur or rotten egg smell and a brown rusty color? And let me go ahead and see what's written here. You guys can read it too. Chlorination is often, or some type of a disinfection is often used for the sulfur odors. It's usually assumed that it's some type of a sulfur bacteria. Let's see. Yeah, sometimes you'll hear about shock chlorination of a well, and that may be great if that would work. I've had some health department people tell me they've had to have customers chlorinate a few times, like to get rid of layers of bacteria. If that doesn't get rid of it, then you'd probably have to go to some type of a continuous chlorination system. The brown color is listed here. We get a lot of questions about brown rusty stains. It's almost always iron. There's a couple things you can do about the iron sediments. Some of it will be precipitated already, and then you could put in a sediment filter right after your pressure tank. A common pore size is around 1/2 micron. You can go bigger if your filters are clogging up, but then you might not trap everything. Another thing you can do with rust or iron is if it's dissolved and then precipitates after it's gone past that initial filter, you will likely need to use an iron filter or a water softener. If you use a water softener, just ask your dealer for one that's rated for the amount of iron that you have in it. I know that they do say that in some areas there are tannins. Those are dissolved materials. The softener is not going to take those out, but they do make some filters, some tannin removing filters. But just talk to your dealers about those.
Yeah, I just had a thing about tannins on in the bathroom of a hotel I was at last week. That they have
Interesting.
water. Yeah, because of the color.
Because it'll be noticeable, and it won't settle out either. So it'll be, your whole bathtub will look a little bit,
Tan.
like it's got.
Yeah. Interesting. Thank you.
Yep.
Okay, and I meant to change that from some of the comments you gave me this morning. I forgot. I apologize. So what can be done to lower nitrate levels in drinking water? And Dan, you answered this question for me, but I'll read it here. First, again, the real issue is finding the source. If you have nitrate in your well, it means one of two things. You either have a source close by, like a septic could be that source, or it's in the shallow groundwater because of farming or whatever, and that also means then that there's a near-surface pathway into your well. So what I was trying to say here is if it's a deeper well, for instance, the well that we were looking at the water quality earlier, where it's got 230 feet of casing and then a screen, you should not have nitrate in that well. I guess it can happen, but it's very rare that it would be in the groundwater itself. It's got to be a breach in your with the well as far as not being sealed properly. But there certainly are cases. I mentioned I was in New York last summer. They have a number of wells that are 300 or 400 feet deep that might only have 10 or 12 feet of casing. And so whenever, below that 12 feet, it's just an open hole cut into the bedrock. And so if there's any fractures that actually go up to the surface or intersect another fracture that might go to a lake or some other, a sinkhole or anything else, then you can certainly have you'll always have a problem because it's in the actual groundwater that you're pulling for your well. And I said here, as if you're using a shallow water source, and generally we would say 50 feet is a guide. If it's coming from less than 50 feet below land surface, then there's more potential for surface contamination, and it may be that your well is properly constructed, but you just don't have a long casing, or it's a shallow aquifer, and then and this is where Dan comes in as far as demineralization treatment, like reverse osmosis. So.
Yep. Yeah, if you can't get rid of it, a lot of sites will point this out, but you don't boil the water. That's the case for a lot of these things. Yeah, you'd probably need reverse osmosis.
Because, there's issues even like with coliform bacteria, certain types of geology, like karst geology, where there's a lot of sinkholes and caves. One of our counties in Illinois that's in karst geology, 80% of the samples their county health department sends in to test have coliform. And because of that, the bacteria has basically become ubiquitous in the entire aquifer, and there's always going to be a surface source that allow contaminants to get into the groundwater there. And so there's really no way to protect your well from that shallow source of bacteria. And so in those cases, similar to a spring, you would recommend continuous disinfection, whether that be UV or chlorination. But, you'd need continuous disinfection like a community would use that's using a lake or surface water supply in order to be sure that, you're protecting from those things. So if a well is found to be unsafe, who provides assistance on how to correct the problem? Well, so what we've said here is check with your local health department and ask them for advice. And because it is a matter of they understand in most cases the issues locally and what options you might have. There are other options as far as you can talk to Extension if there's a strong county extension land or like an agricultural area, and also well drillers and contractors, or even the state agency that regulates well construction and drillers. You can call them. I know talking about the Washington Department of Ecology, when I get a question from a well owner in Washington State, if it's related at all to a question like this, then, my job is to get that well owner back to their local or state agency that can help them and understands their issues a lot better than I do, because they've dealt with them in that state. And so, the real trick here is to not be afraid to contact somebody and try to find out. Universities that have groups like us or a geological survey may also be another source. But as far as assistance, there are certainly folks who can give you proper well construction issues, and contractors who can do things like I mentioned the well that was PVC and had the tree in the yard. What I recommended they do is get someone to camera the well. They've got drop-down cameras now that can go in a well and take a look at the integrity of the casing and determine if there's a crack or a breach, or see where water might be coming in somewhere where maybe a weld failed, that sort of thing. It comes down to the same issues. You identify the problem and what's causing it, and then you can look at options for fixing it. But and if on the side of financial assistance, there's really not a lot of that out there. In some cases, we mentioned the Indiana or the Iowa program. They might be able to provide some help depending on why. USDA funds programs to help pay for treatment and well upgrades, and in some cases even new wells where it's really a problem, but that's an income-based program. And so, there's a certain level of income that they would not provide that for. And sometimes they're loans and sometimes they can be grants. But that's all I have on that, I think. And I know the National Groundwater Association on their website, wellowner.org, if you just type in finance in the search, there's a page they have where they list some of the agencies that might have some of those loans. I know several of the RCAP regions actually have the loan program, RCAC, the Western RCAP, SURCAP, the Southeast RCAP, and I think there might be one more, maybe Great Lakes RCAP, and that's 3 of the 6 regional RCAP offices have a program for providing that support. Again, it's income-based. So this is a very open-ended question I thought was worth at least discussing. What are the major contaminants found in groundwater in the U.S.? And I think we have shown already that it really varies depending on where you're at. And some states have taken steps to help their well owners understand those things online. But, just mentioned some of the common things: arsenic, nitrate, radium, uranium fluoride. There's a lot of others. And depending on your area, there can be a lot of unique geology that causes certain types. Dan mentioned barium and strontium, and there's a lot of different things. I would contact your state geological survey in most states. Most states don't have a water survey like we do. In Illinois, I'd certainly suggest you contact us. And so, the other agencies that are doing a lot of source water testing would be a state geological survey or the USGS state office in your state. I know, again, mentioning going to New York last summer, one of the folks I talked to was the USGS office in New York. They've done a lot of work looking at the shallow geology of New York State and had a lot of good documents that they've put out over the years talking about the geology and some of the water quality issues. So, and those folks, they're mostly geologists and engineers, and they're ready to help you. You just call them, get to the right person. They're more than willing to take a look at where you live and what situation you might have. You find out really interesting things when you do that. Sometimes you may find out there's another aquifer. We have places in Illinois, there might be 3 or 4 different aquifers all at one location. It just depends on how deep you drill. And so, those are worthwhile to find out. So, yeah. So that's the questions. I'm going to quickly talk about the private well class. If you're not aware, what we find is a lot of people find out about our webinars through other sources. And it's really not the main part of our program. It's really this 10 lesson class. So I'm going to mention that, and then we'll get to the questions if anybody has any. Again, if you have a question, put it in the question or chat box on the GoToWebinar screen that you have. And Katie will put those in a Google Doc that I can pull up in a little bit. So the private well class started as a series of 10 lessons. And the way it's set up is you sign up on our website, and it sends you one lesson a week to your email address as a PDF over 10 weeks. So it's self-paced. You're on your own. And so it's up to you. It's about 80-some pages of material in the end with all 10. There's a pre-test, a post-test, and an evaluation that goes along with it. And so these webinars are meant to be a little more specific about some of the issues that many well owners face, and like today, about common questions about water quality, really. And then also on our website, we have a lot of other material, and that's growing. As our funding continues from RCAP and US EPA, we've been able to accomplish a number of other things. And one of those that should be done soon is an FAQ page that in theory, every question we've gotten from all of our webinars will eventually be answered and available as a sortable database on our FAQ. And I think that'll be really valuable to many well owners once it's ready. And we're working on that now. And so this is the URL, privatewellclass.org. And so when you go there, this is the front page. You click on the little envelope over here on the bottom left, and that's how you could sign up then to take the class. We've started developing podcasts, which are a lot more popular than I thought they'd be, which is a tribute to Katie and Jennifer at the Water Resources Center. And then we also have this Learn by Video, and there's two things there. One are the recordings of the webinars, like the webinar we're doing today, and the other are these short videos that I'll just show quickly here. So if you click on the email link, it takes you to a page where it asks for your email address, your first name, and where you live, and that's really it. And it's so that we can get the information back to you, and the where you live is so that we can show EPA that we're actually reaching folks in all 50 states as part of our grant. This is a national program, and the idea is that we're actually able to reach out to folks everywhere. Actually, we certainly have people in every state who've taken our class, as well as about, 11 to 13 countries. So it's been really popular. We've had close to 5,500 people who've taken it online. And, if you haven't taken our class, we certainly recommend you signed up. It'll just send you an email once a week. You get to them when you can. They're much more in-depth and provide a lot of good information about well types and how water gets in your well, as well as, issues of sampling and treatment and all that. So if you go to the videos page, there's two categories, training videos, and this says there's 16, and webinar recordings. As of August 30th, we had 23 of those on our site. We did this webinar on lead, specifically about lead, on August 30th, and this is just one of those 23. Now there's 28 or so that are up there. Like I said, we record every one and make them available. We try to answer different questions each time, and so there's a lot of good information at the end about some of the questions that folks have asked us as well. The other part of this are these short videos. This is they're meant to be about one specific topic. So how does my private well system work? What do I do after a fire? How does a bored well work? How does a drilled well work? What's a bedrock well? We have one on there that's how does my pressure tank work? And these went up around, January 25th, 2016, this one was put up, and that's about right for all of them. They all went up about the same time. And the how does my pressure tank work's had over 52,000 hits already. And so what that's told us is that there's not a lot of information out there for well owners about the pressure tanks, and it's something they really need to know, especially if you're having problems and your pump's kicking on and off, and maybe a problem with the bladder in your tank or some other issue. And just understanding that stuff may help you as a well owner know what kind of problem you might be having. For each lesson, so it sends you this PDF, but then on our website we also have this resource library that for each lesson lists a bunch of other documents that are publicly available and free that you can go to for more information. So you can see this is 1 and 2 for lessons 1 and 2. And so like the Michigan Flowing Well Handbook, the first reference listed there under 2, Michigan was losing 28 million gallons a day to flowing wells, so they decided to stop that. They passed a law that requires you to cap a flowing well in Michigan. And this handbook is a great document that not only explains flowing wells and the history of that in Michigan, but also has diagrams and shows proper capping and construction for a well that's going to flow. So Raymond Lyle's mentioned here a lot. He developed a number of bulletins and reports back in the 90s and late 80s for New York, for Cornell. They're really good. He had quite a unique style of showing concepts about groundwater and water movement that I think are very clear. And so in lessons 1 and 2, you'll find a number of the figures from his bulletins in our lessons. And it's because they're really good at explaining those concepts to everyone. So a lot of good stuff on there. Yeah, that's all I'll say about that. And so in the end, if you're a well owner, what we're trying to do is to give you a good basic class on how your well works and, some of the issues that are related to being a private well owner so that you understand why it's important and why you need to understand how it works, and mostly then how those things go together to help you protect yourself from risk. And so, our goal really is to help you become more informed so that when you do contact your health department or your state agency or your geological survey or even, your contractor, you have a little more wherewithal on what questions to ask and how to ask those questions, and you understand those basics so that, it'll help you. You're a water operator. That's the bottom line. Communities pay folks, have a whole department for water operations to make sure that the water is being pumped properly, being treated properly, being delivered properly. And, you're the water operator for a very small water system, your private well in your house. And so those things are important. It's an investment. Katie did a survey, I think, of 8 different states where she contacted just a random driller in each of those 8 states and asked them, 1, how much would a 200-foot steel casing well cost? And 2, I think it was about how long will a pump last? And we got differences from, I think in Missouri it was $6,000 for that well to as much as in New Jersey it was $25,000. And so, that's quite an investment to make. And so understanding your well is, if you have to replace it especially, is something that you really should have, some understanding of. So I said here 5 more minutes for questions, and then we'll take questions, but it looks like we have 2 questions. And so instead of taking a break, it's almost 2:30, and I think I'm just going to pull those over. And I may have answered them both, actually. So I'm going to pull these over. And Dan, can you see those?
Yeah,
okay.
I can see them.
Okay. So I think I already mentioned this. So what's the difference between a house piping before and after 1986? As I mentioned, I'm not a lead expert. And when we did the lead webinar, we brought in resources from both US EPA and a researcher from Virginia Tech. And if you want to really understand lead and copper with lead solder and some of those issues, because brass fittings, galvanized pipe, all contain lead, I recommend you watch our webinar. It's online. And then if you have questions, you can email us. On our website, at the bottom of the page, there's a link to, or it lists our email address. It's info@privatewellclass.org. And if there's a specific question, if Dan or I can't answer it, we can get it to one of those folks who can. And but yeah, this 1986 is a magic date. In some states it was earlier, it may have been different, but it's really when lead piping became more of a focus for not being used. And there may be other things there that happened in 1986. But I know the latest lead law was about lead solder and the amount of lead that can be in, for instance, a fitting or, in any kind of fittings. And until 2014, you could have as much as 8%, I believe, of lead in some, even if it's copper piping or if it's a brass fitting, there could be as much as 8% lead there. And so, anything, especially if your water's corrosive, and, working with the folks from US EPA and talking to some, like Dan and some other chemists that have labs, it's not enough necessarily just to sample for lead, because the amount of lead that you see in a sample can depend on how long the water's been sitting, how long you've ran the water can be different before you take the sample. It's really good to just understand the water quality and how corrosive it might be. And that's a little more involved. And that list of contaminants, or that list of things we recommend testing for that included chloride and alkalinity and some other things, gives you a good feel qualified person can give you a good idea if your water might be corrosive. So I know what Dan does. There's 5 different indices that you can use to determine whether something's scale forming or corrosive, and they've got this all set up in a little program that they can put in the results, and it looks at all 5 indices and gives you this is scale forming or this is corrosive and that sort of thing, and that's what they then would recommend to a well owner. So I think I've talked that one. Dan, anything to add?
No, that's pretty good.
All right. And as far as the best method to reduce nitrate, we answered that question already, and it was one that was asked when everyone signed up. So I see no other questions. And again, if you think of something later, let us know. You can email us at info@privatewellclass.org. I certainly encourage you to sign up for our class. And if you have other suggestions or there's other things that you'd like to learn about, that's another thing you can do is email us. We're certainly open to suggestions. The more we work on this project around the country and learn about differences in well construction and geology and even piping materials and what's allowed in different states or where testing's being done or not done, we're learning every day too. So ask and we will certainly try to get back with you. And that's all I have.
Hey,
yeah.
Steve, can I just talk about the continuing education credits really quickly?
That would be great.
Okay, so we have not yet, but we will be submitting our 90-minute webinar topics for pre-approval through NEHA. So for attending the webinar today, including anyone who is a sanitarian or environmental health professional, you can earn up to 1.5 continuing education credits, and I think Steve already mentioned that. NEHA generally allows for 1 hour equals 1 CEU, so this webinar lasted about an hour and a half. We don't regulate the amount of CEUs that an individual state can give for our webinars, but assuming if a state follows NEHA's guidelines, it should be the same. So in most cases, states and other credentialing agencies will give you credit if you apply. So if you guys are trying to get credit through that way, if you apply generally, you can receive it. We can issue a certificate of attendance or a NEHA continuing education attendance form, or both if you need both. So this will not be done automatically. If you want a certificate or an attendance form, then you must email us at info@privatewellclass.org, and I can take care of all of that for you.
Well, I put that in the wrong spot, but here we go. Here's the, that's the email address. And again, that's on our website as well. So, and we are going to apply for through NEHA for the CEs for this. We just haven't done it yet. We just had another grant start. NEHA is one of the partners on the grant. And the other thing to mention, if you are a sanitarian, which I forgot to mention, is that through our partnership with NEHA, they've put our class on their website. So you can go into their e-learning center as a NEHA, or you don't even have to be a NEHA member. You do have to register on their site, and it's free. You can go in and take each lesson there, and there's a quiz at the end of each one, and each of the 10 lessons is worth 1 CEU for NEHA credentials. So, which is really a nice thing, and hopefully you take advantage of that. So, but once we apply, we have a 4-hour workshop we do for sanitarians, and when we applied for that through NEHA, they gave us a specific form, and once we've done this, we repeat this webinar probably 2 or 3 times a year, and so for 2017, if you're here this time, you probably can't get credit for it again, but we have a number of other webinars that are on varying topics, or one that's just for EHPs, and we have one that's just on septic systems that you probably can get credit for, and we'll probably be applying for all those at once so that we have those forms, and then we could have handouts on our webinar that you can download after that. So I think that's it. Katie?
That's all I have.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you everyone for attending, and yeah, check out our site. Take care.